In the shadow of the Manhattan skyline, where the sounds of ragtime drifted through the streets of Harlem, a group of men gathered with a dream that seemed impossible in the America of 1916. They were African Americans living in a country that viewed them as second-class citizens, yet they harbored an unshakable desire to serve their nation in uniform. These men would become the 369th Infantry Regiment, though history would remember them by a different name entirely. A name born not from American lips, but from the grudging respect of German soldiers who faced them across the muddy battlefields of France. They called them Hollenkämpfer, the Hellfighters. But the story of the Harlem Hellfighters begins not in the trenches of the Western Front, but in the bustling streets of New York City, where prejudice and possibility walked hand in hand through the early decades of the 20th century. It begins with a simple yet revolutionary idea that African American men could stand shoulder to shoulder with any soldier in the world, if only they were given the chance. The year was 1913, and America was a nation divided by invisible yet impenetrable barriers of race. In the South, Jim Crow laws ensured that African Americans remained segregated and subjugated. In the North, while formal segregation was less prevalent, discrimination was no less real. For African Americans living in Harlem, the prospect of military service represented more than just duty to country. It represented dignity, respect, and perhaps most importantly, the chance to prove their worth as Americans. The creation of what would become the 369th Infantry Regiment was itself a minor miracle in this climate of institutionalized racism. On June 2, 1913, New York Governor William Sulzer signed legislation authorizing the formation of the 15th New York Infantry Regiment, the state's first African-American National Guard unit. The bill had faced significant opposition from white politicians who questioned whether black men could serve effectively as soldiers. It was a debate that would follow the regiment throughout its existence, even as they proved their critics wrong with blood and valor on foreign soil. The man chosen to command this groundbreaking unit was Colonel William Haywood, a white lawyer and politician who had served as Governor Sulzer's campaign manager. Haywood's appointment was controversial, as many within the African American community had hoped for black leadership. Yet Haywood would prove to be more than just a political appointee. He genuinely believed in the potential of his men and would fight tirelessly for their rights and recognition, even when it put him at odds with his military superiors. Haywood faced an immediate challenge. While the legislation had authorized the creation of the regiment, it had not provided the resources necessary for its success. The 15th Infantry had no armory, no equipment, and initially, precious few volunteers. The regiment was forced to train at Lafayette Hall on 7th Avenue and 122nd Street in Harlem, a far cry from the purpose-built facilities enjoyed by white National Guard units. The early days of the 15th Infantry were marked by struggle and uncertainty. By the summer of 1916, only a few hundred men had enlisted, far short of the several thousand needed for a full-strength regiment. Many African Americans in New York remained skeptical of the military, viewing it as just another institution that would use them while denying them dignity and advancement. The regiment's fortunes seemed uncertain until the arrival of a man who would change everything. Lieutenant James Reese Europe joined the 15th Infantry in September 1916, bringing with him not just military experience from previous service, but something far more valuable, a reputation as one of the most talented musicians in New York City. Europe had already made history in 1912 when his Clef Club Orchestra became the first African-American musical group to perform at Carnegie Hall. His music was revolutionary, blending ragtime with elements that would later be recognized as the foundations of jazz. Colonel Haywood recognized the potential that Europe represented. Music had always been central to military tradition, and an outstanding regimental band could serve multiple purposes. It would boost morale among the troops, help with recruitment, and demonstrate to skeptics that the 15th Infantry was a first-class military unit deserving of respect. Haywood gave Europe $10,000 and carte blanche to create the finest military band in the American Army. Europe took his mission seriously. He traveled as far as Puerto Rico to recruit musicians, personally auditioning each candidate. Among those he recruited was Noble Sissle, a young singer and songwriter who would serve as the band's drum major. Together, Europe and Sissle began building something unprecedented, a military band that would not only serve the regiment, but would help introduce jazz music to the world. The impact was immediate. News of Europe's band spread throughout New York's African-American community, and suddenly, enlistment began to surge. Musicians, inspired by Europe's example, enlisted in droves. But they weren't the only ones. Word spread that the 15th Infantry was becoming something special, a place where African-American men could serve with pride and dignity. Hotel porters, doormen, mailmen and laborers from across New York City began making their way to Lafayette Hall to enlist. By the time America entered World War I in April 1917, the 15th Infantry had been recruited to full strength. Over 2,000 men had joined the ranks, coming not just from New York City, but from upstate New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and as far away as Virginia. The regiment was diverse in more ways than just geography. While the majority of soldiers were African American, the unit also included men from Puerto Rico, Cuba, Guyana, Liberia, Portugal, Canada, and the West Indies. It was a melting pot of backgrounds and experiences, united by a common desire to serve. Among the men who enlisted was Henry Johnson, a 25-year-old railroad porter from Albany. Johnson had been born in North Carolina to tobacco farming parents, but like many African Americans of his generation, he had migrated north in search of better opportunities. He found work as a baggage porter, humble employment that nonetheless provided him with a steady income and a measure of independence. When the call came to serve his country, Johnson answered without hesitation. Another notable enlistee was Needham Roberts, just 17 years old when he convinced recruiting officers that he was old enough to serve. Roberts came from Trenton, New Jersey, where his father served as a pastor. The young man had been working as a clerk in a local drugstore when war broke out, but he was determined to trade his civilian employment for a soldier's uniform. The regiment's diversity extended beyond its enlisted ranks. While Colonel Haywood and most of the senior officers were white, reflecting the prejudices and political realities of the time, Haywood made efforts to include African American officers where possible. Charles Fillmore, a veteran of the Spanish-American War who had been instrumental in the campaign to establish the regiment, was commissioned as a captain and made a company commander. It was a small step toward equality, but an important one nonetheless. As the 15th Infantry prepared for federal service, they faced their first taste of the discrimination that would follow them throughout their military career. When New York's National Guard units were organized into the Rainbow Division for deployment overseas, the 15th Infantry was excluded. As one official explained with stunning callousness, "Black is not a color in the rainbow." The slight was deeply felt by the men of the regiment, who had trained just as hard and were just as eager to serve as their white counterparts. On July 25, 1917, the 15th Infantry was called into federal service at Camp Whitman, New York. The transition from State National Guard unit to Federal Army Regiment brought new challenges and opportunities. The men underwent intensive military training, learning the fundamentals of soldiering that would serve them well in the trenches of France. But even as they trained, questions remained about how the army would ultimately use them. In October 1917, the regiment was transferred to Camp Wadsworth in Spartanburg, South Carolina, for advanced training. The move south proved to be an eye-opening experience for many of the soldiers, particularly those from New York who had never experienced the full brutality of Southern segregation. The men of the 15th Infantry found themselves subjected to a level of racial hostility that was shocking even by the standards of the era. Local businesses refused to serve the black soldiers. Restaurants would not seat them. Hotels would not accommodate them. Even attempts to purchase newspapers from street vendors were met with refusal. The situation reached a boiling point when Lieutenant James Reese Europe and Noble Cecil were refused service at a hotel shop while attempting to buy a newspaper. The incident could have escalated into violence, but Europe, displaying the discipline and restraint that would characterize the regiment throughout their service, directed his men to avoid confrontation. Ironically, it was white soldiers from New York's 27th Division who stood up for their fellow New Yorkers. When they witnessed the discrimination faced by the men of the 15th Infantry, soldiers from the 27th Division told local merchants that if they would not serve black soldiers, they would take their business elsewhere. "They're our buddies," the white soldiers declared, "and we won't buy from men who treat them unfairly." It was a small gesture of solidarity, but one that was deeply appreciated by the men of the 15th Infantry. Despite this show of support from some white soldiers, the situation in Spartanburg became untenable. Local authorities and citizens made it clear that they would not tolerate the presence of armed black soldiers in their community. Tensions escalated to the point where military officials feared violence might erupt. After less than 2 weeks at Camp Wadsworth, the 15th Infantry was hastily removed and sent to Camp Mills on Long Island to complete their training. The incident at Spartanburg was a stark reminder of the challenges faced by African American soldiers. Just months earlier, members of the 24th Infantry had rioted in Houston after facing similar discrimination and harassment. The Houston riot had resulted in multiple deaths and had reinforced stereotypes about the supposed inability of black soldiers to maintain discipline under pressure. The men of the 15th Infantry were determined not to repeat those mistakes, even when faced with provocation. As 1917 drew to a close, the regiment prepared for deployment overseas. On November 11, 1917, they were sent to Hoboken, New Jersey, to board the USS Pocahontas, a former German commercial vessel that had been seized by the United States and converted into a troop transport. After several delays, the ship finally departed on December 12th, carrying the men of the 15th Infantry toward an uncertain future in war-torn Europe. The voyage across the Atlantic was marked by the same segregation that had characterized the regiment's experience in America. While white troops enjoyed better accommodations and treatment, the men of the 15th Infantry were crowded into inferior quarters and subjected to the indignities of institutional racism, even while crossing the ocean to fight for their country. Yet their spirits remained high, buoyed by the knowledge that they were finally getting their chance to prove themselves in combat. On December 27, 1917, the ship arrived in Brest, France. As the men disembarked, Lieutenant Europe's regimental band struck up a jazz rendition of La Marseillaise, the French national anthem. The French soldiers and civilians on the docks were astonished by the syncopated rhythms and soulful melodies they had never heard before. It was many French citizens' first exposure to jazz music, and it marked the beginning of a cultural exchange that would have lasting impacts far beyond the war. From Brest, the regiment was transported to Saint-Nazaire, where they were assigned to labor duties rather than combat training. Like most African American units in World War I, the 15th Infantry found themselves relegated to support roles, building docks, constructing railroads, and unloading supply ships. It was frustrating work for men who had volunteered to fight, not to serve as laborers. Colonel Hayward repeatedly petitioned his superiors to allow his men to see combat, arguing that they were soldiers, not construction workers. The discrimination faced by African American troops in France was not limited to their American commanders. General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, was so concerned about maintaining racial segregation that he issued a notorious pamphlet titled Secret Information Concerning Black American Troops. The document warned French military and civilian authorities about the alleged inferior nature of African American soldiers and perpetuated racist stereotypes about their supposed tendencies toward criminal behavior. Despite these efforts to poison French attitudes toward African American troops, the French had a different perspective on racial matters. France had long employed colonial troops from Africa and other parts of their empire, and French military commanders were accustomed to working with black soldiers. More importantly, France was desperately in need of manpower. Years of brutal warfare had decimated French forces, and they could not afford to reject willing soldiers based on racial prejudice. In March 1918, General Pershing made a decision that would change the fate of the 15th Infantry. Rather than continue to use them as laborers or wait for the formation of a separate African-American division, he assigned the regiment to the French Fourth Army. The men turned in their American equipment and were issued French rifles, helmets, and equipment. On March 1, 1918, the 15th Infantry was officially redesignated as the 369th United States Infantry Regiment. Colonel Haywood later wrote to a friend about this transfer, noting with some bitterness that our great American general simply put the black orphan in a basket, set it on the doorstep of the French, pulled the bell, and went away. While Haywood recognized the political motivation behind the transfer, he also understood that it represented an opportunity. Under French command, his men would finally get their chance to fight. After just 3 weeks of training with French weapons and tactics, the 369th Infantry entered the trenches for the first time on April 8, 1918. They were assigned to the French 161st Division and took up positions in the Argonne Forest, one of the most dangerous sectors of the Western Front. The timing could not have been more challenging, as they were entering combat right in the midst of the German Spring Offensive, the enemy's last desperate attempt to win the war before American reinforcements could tip the balance. The Western Front in 1918 was a hellscape of mud, barbed wire, and death. The trenches stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border, a zigzag scar across the landscape where millions of men had died over the previous 4 years. The fighting was characterized by horrific artillery bombardments, poison gas attacks, and futile charges across no man's land that resulted in massive casualties for minimal territorial gains. For the men of the 369th Infantry, many of whom had never experienced combat, the reality of trench warfare was a shock. The constant threat of sniper fire meant that exposing oneself above the parapet, even for a moment, could be fatal. Artillery shells screamed overhead at all hours, some falling short and exploding among their own positions. The ever-present danger of gas attacks meant that soldiers had to be ready to don their masks at a moment's notice, breathing through cumbersome filters that made every activity more difficult. Private Horace Pippin, who would later become a prominent painter, captured the terror of those early days in the trenches. For 2 nights, they gave us shell fire, and the gas were thick, and the forest looked like it were ready to give up all its trees every time a shell came crashing through. We barely knew what to do, for we could not fight shells, but we could the Germans. We would rather face the Germans to come over the top than to have their shells. Despite these challenging conditions, the men of the 369th Infantry quickly adapted to trench warfare. Their French commanders were impressed by their eagerness to learn and their bravery under fire. Unlike many American units that initially struggled with the realities of modern warfare, the 369th proved to be natural soldiers. Their willingness to take risks and their aggressive fighting spirit earned them the respect of their French allies. It was during these early weeks in the trenches that the 369th Infantry had their first significant combat action, an encounter that would make them famous throughout America and establish their reputation as elite fighting men. On the night of May 14, 1918, Private Henry Johnson and Private Needham Roberts were assigned to sentry duty at an isolated listening post in no man's land, about 50 yards forward of the main French lines. The listening post was a dangerous assignment. The 2 men were positioned in a small dugout surrounded by barbed wire, tasked with watching for German patrols and providing early warning of any enemy activity. They were armed with rifles, a small supply of grenades, and their personal weapons. For Johnson, This included a bolo knife, a large cutting tool that had been issued to American troops for use in the trenches. As the night wore on, Johnson and Roberts maintained their vigil, straining their ears for any sound that might indicate German activity. Around 2 in the morning, they heard a faint but distinctive sound, the snip of wire cutters. German raiders were attempting to cut through the barbed wire that protected their position. Johnson immediately fired an illumination rocket into the sky, hoping to spot the enemy and alert the main French lines to the danger. The illumination revealed approximately 25 German soldiers approaching their position. The Germans, realizing they had been discovered, immediately opened fire and began throwing grenades at the listening post. Roberts was hit by shrapnel from one of the grenades, suffering wounds to his head that left him barely conscious and unable to fight effectively. Johnson found himself essentially alone against overwhelming odds. He began throwing grenades at the advancing Germans, with Roberts managing to pass him additional grenades despite his wounds. When his supply of grenades was exhausted, Johnson grabbed his rifle and began firing at the enemy, but the rifle soon jammed, leaving him with no ranged weapons. The German soldiers rushed into the listening post, attempting to capture the 2 Americans. 2 of them grabbed Roberts and began dragging him away, presumably to interrogate him behind German lines. It was at this moment that Henry Johnson made the decision that would make him famous. Despite being severely outnumbered and armed only with his bolo knife, he charged at the Germans who were attempting to capture his comrade. What followed was a desperate hand-to-hand combat that would later be dubbed the Battle of Henry Johnson. Johnson wielded his bolo knife with deadly efficiency, stabbing one German soldier in the stomach and another in the ribs. When more Germans rushed at him, he continued fighting, using his rifle as a club until the stock splintered. Despite suffering 21 separate wounds from bullets, bayonets, and grenades, Johnson continued to fight. The sound of the battle had alerted French and American reinforcements, who began moving toward the listening post. Realizing that help was on the way and that they had failed to capture their intended prisoners, the German raiders retreated back to their own lines, carrying their dead and wounded with them. When the reinforcements arrived, they found Johnson barely conscious from loss of blood, but alive. Roberts, despite his wounds, had also survived the attack. A US Army captain who investigated the scene the next day estimated that Johnson had killed at least 4 German soldiers and wounded several others. The evidence of the fierce struggle was clear. German blood stained the ground around the listening post, and equipment abandoned by the retreating raiders was scattered throughout the area. It had been a small action in the context of the larger war, but the courage displayed by Johnson and Roberts captured the imagination of the American public. Word of the battle reached American newspapers within days. 2 New York Negro soldiers foiled German assault, declared the New York World's headline on May 20th, 1918. Pershing praises brave Negroes, read the New York Sun headline the following day. For Americans hungry for heroes in a war that had so far produced mostly stalemate and casualties, the story of Henry Johnson's desperate fight resonated powerfully. The French military leadership was also impressed by the actions of Johnson and Roberts. On May 16th, just one day after the battle, both men were awarded the Croix de Guerre, France's highest military honor. Johnson's medal included the coveted gold palm for extraordinary valor, making him the first American soldier of any race to receive this distinction. The French citation for Johnson stated that he had given a magnificent example of courage and energy. The recognition from France stood in stark contrast to the response from the American military hierarchy. While newspapers celebrated Johnson and Roberts as heroes, the US Army was slower to acknowledge their achievements. It would be decades before Johnson received any official recognition from his own country, a delay that reflected the persistent racial prejudices of American military leadership. Despite this official indifference, Johnson became a celebrity among African Americans and a symbol of what black soldiers could achieve when given the opportunity to fight. His image was used in recruitment posters and propaganda materials, with slogans like, "Henry Johnson licked a dozen Germans. How many stamps have you licked?" Former President Theodore Roosevelt called Johnson one of the 5 bravest Americans to serve in World War I. For Johnson himself, the experience was both a source of pride and a burden. When asked about his actions, he was characteristically modest. "There wasn't anything so fine about it, just fought for my life. A rabbit would have done that." But the battle had taken its toll. Johnson's 21 wounds left him partially disabled, and the psychological trauma of the experience would haunt him for the rest of his life. The success of Johnson and Roberts was just the beginning for the 369th Infantry. Throughout the spring and summer of 1918, the regiment continued to distinguish itself in combat operations along the Western Front. They participated in the Second Battle of the Marne, Germany's final major offensive of the war, helping to blunt the German advance and then taking part in the French counterattack that pushed the enemy back. During the Second Battle of the Marne, the 369th Infantry demonstrated the same courage and tenacity that had characterized Johnson's individual action. Under heavy artillery bombardment and facing determined German attacks, the regiment held its positions without giving ground. When the French launched their counter-offensive on July 18th, the men of the 369th advanced alongside their French comrades, helping to drive the Germans back across the Marne River. The fighting was brutal and costly. The regiment lost 14 killed and 51 wounded during the Marne offensive, but they had proven themselves as effective combat soldiers. Their French commanders praised their aggressiveness and their ability to maintain discipline under fire. Word began to spread through the German army about these fierce African-American soldiers who seemed to fight with unusual determination. It was during this period that the Germans began referring to the 369th Infantry as Hollenkämpfer, or Hellfighters. According to some accounts, captured German prisoners reported that the African-American soldiers were devils who smile while they kill and won't be taken alive. Whether this account is entirely accurate or partly apocryphal, the nickname stuck, and the 369th Infantry began to be known as the Harlem Hellfighters. The men of the regiment embraced their nickname with pride. Among themselves, they had been calling themselves the Black Rattlers, complete with a coiled rattlesnake on their unit insignia. The French soldiers they fought alongside called them Men of Bronze, Hommes de Bronze, a tribute to their courage under fire. But it was the German-coined nickname of Hellfighters that captured the imagination of the American public and became permanently associated with the regiment. While the infantry companies of the 369th were earning their reputation in the trenches, Lieutenant James Reese Europe and his regimental band were making their own mark on the war effort. Europe had been wounded in a German gas attack in June 1918, an experience that inspired him to compose one of his most famous songs, On Patrol in No Man's Land, while he was recovering in a field hospital. After Europe recovered from his wounds, he was deemed unfit for combat duty, but was allowed to continue leading the regimental band. At the request of American Expeditionary Forces headquarters, Europe took his musicians to Paris, where they spent 8 weeks performing for troops, dignitaries, and French civilians. The impact of these performances cannot be overstated. At a concert in Paris's Jardin des Tuileries that included bands from Britain, Italy, and France, Europe's band played W.C. Handy's Memphis Blues and St. Louis Blues for an enormous crowd that had never heard anything like jazz music before. The rhythms were revolutionary, the melodies were infectious, and the overall effect was electrifying. Everywhere we gave a concert, it was a riot, Europe told a New York Tribune reporter. We played to 50,000 people at least, and had we wished it, we might be playing yet. The 369th Infantry Regiment's band is widely credited with introducing jazz music to Europe. While some Parisians had heard American popular music before, The sophisticated jazz arrangements performed by Europe's musicians were something entirely new. The band's performances helped launch what would become a European fascination with jazz that continues to this day. Europe understood the cultural significance of what his band was achieving. After the war, he reflected on their success. "I have come from France more firmly convinced than ever that Negroes should write Negro music. We have our own racial feeling, and if we try to copy whites, we will make bad copies. We won France by playing music which was ours, and not a pale imitation of others. And if we are to develop in America, we must develop along our own lines." While Europe and his band were conquering European audiences with their music, the infantry companies of the 369th continued their bloody work in the trenches. Throughout the summer of 1918, they participated in various French offensives, gradually pushing the German army back from positions they had held for years. The fighting was still intense, but the momentum of the war had clearly shifted in favor of the Allies. In September 1918, the 369th Infantry was assigned to participate in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the largest military operation in American history. The offensive was designed to break through German defensive lines and force a decisive end to the war. Over 1 million American soldiers would participate in the operation, which would last for 47 days and result in over 120,000 American casualties. For the 369th Infantry, the Meuse-Argonne offensive represented their greatest test as combat soldiers. They were assigned to attack strongly defended German positions in the Champagne region, facing well-prepared enemy troops who had years to construct fortifications. The attack began on September 26, 1918, with the 369th advancing alongside French colonial troops against determined German resistance. The fighting was some of the most intense of the war. German machine gun nests commanded excellent fields of fire, and artillery had been pre-registered on likely avenues of approach. The 369th Infantry attacked with characteristic aggressiveness, but the casualties were heavy. In just a few days of fighting, the regiment lost 851 men killed and wounded, nearly 1/3 of their strength. Despite these horrific losses, the 369th Infantry achieved their objectives. They captured the village of Séchault and continued advancing, helping to break through German defensive lines that had been considered impregnable. The French town of Ripon fell to their assault, and they continued pushing the enemy back for weeks. The cost of their success was staggering. By the end of the war, the 369th Infantry had suffered approximately 1,500 casualties, more than any other American regiment. These losses reflected both their extended time in combat and their aggressive fighting style. The regiment had spent 191 consecutive days on the front lines, longer than any other American unit in the war, but their sacrifices had not been in vain. The 369th Infantry had proven beyond any doubt that African American soldiers could fight as effectively as any troops in the world. Their French commanders recognized this with a remarkable honor. The entire regiment was awarded the Croix de Guerre with Silver Star. Additionally, 171 individual members of the regiment received personal decorations for valor, more than any other American unit. On November 11th, 1918, the armistice went into effect, officially ending World War I. The men of the 369th Infantry, who had been among the first American troops to enter combat, had also been among the last to fight. They had the distinction of being the first Allied unit to reach the Rhine River in Germany, symbolically completing their journey from the training halls of Harlem to the heart of the former enemy territory. As the guns fell silent and the war came to an end, the soldiers of the 369th Infantry could look back on their service with justifiable pride. They had faced discrimination and prejudice from their own country, yet they had served with honor and distinction. They had proven that courage and patriotism were not determined by the color of a man's skin, but by the content of his character and his willingness to sacrifice for his beliefs. The end of the war brought new challenges for the men of the 369th Infantry. While they had distinguished themselves on the battlefield, they still faced the reality of returning to a country where racial segregation and discrimination remained the norm. The question of how they would be received at home weighed heavily on the minds of many soldiers. The answer came on February 17, 1919, when the 369th Infantry Regiment became the first American unit to return to New York City from the war. The homecoming was everything the men could have hoped for and more. Nearly 1 million New Yorkers lined Fifth Avenue to welcome home their heroes, creating one of the largest celebrations in the city's history. The Victory Parade began at 23rd Street and Fifth Avenue at 11 o'clock in the morning, symbolically echoing the time when the armistice had taken effect 3 months earlier. The parade stretched for 7 miles, winding its way through Manhattan before ending in Harlem at 145th Street and Lenox Avenue. It was a triumphal procession that celebrated not just military victory, but the breaking down of racial barriers through courage and sacrifice. At the head of the parade marched Lieutenant James Reese Europe and his regimental band, playing the jazz music that had made them famous in France. Behind them came the combat veterans of the regiment, many still bearing the visible scars of their service. Private Henry Johnson, despite his disabilities from his wounds, rode in an open car at the front of the procession, holding a bouquet of flowers and acknowledging the cheers of the crowd. The reception in Harlem was particularly emotional. 70% of the 369th Infantry soldiers called Harlem home, and their families, friends, and neighbors had turned out in massive numbers to welcome them back. The Chicago Defender reported that February 17, 1919, was an unofficial holiday in Harlem, with the Board of Education granting dismissal to black schoolchildren so they could witness the historic parade. Among the dignitaries present to review the troops was New York Governor Al Smith, who watched from reviewing stands at 60th and 133rd Streets. Also present was Emmett Scott, the Special Adjutant to the Secretary of War, and newspaper publisher William Randolph Hearst. The presence of these prominent figures underscored the significance of the moment and the recognition that the 369th Infantry had earned through their service. The parade was particularly meaningful because it stood in stark contrast to the regiment's treatment before the war. When the 369th had departed for France in December 1917, they had been excluded from the farewell parade of New York's other National Guard units. The official explanation had been that black is not a color in the rainbow, referring to the Rainbow Division that included most of New York's white National Guard regiments. Now, less than 15 months later, these same men were being celebrated as heroes. The irony was not lost on the soldiers or the crowds who cheered them. The parade represented a moment of vindication, proof that the men of the 369th Infantry had earned their place as equals through their service and sacrifice. The Victory Parade in New York was not unique. Similar celebrations were held in other cities as African American veterans returned home. In Chicago, the 370th Infantry Regiment, formerly the 8th Illinois, received a hero's welcome on the same day as the 369th's parade in New York. Even in the Jim Crow South, there were celebrations of returning black veterans, most notably in Savannah, Georgia, despite the fact that Georgia had led the nation in lynchings during 1917 and 1918. These celebrations represented a high watermark in race relations, a moment when the contributions of African American soldiers were universally acknowledged and appreciated, but they also masked the underlying tensions that would soon resurface as the euphoria of victory faded and the realities of peacetime reasserted themselves. The men of the 369th Infantry quickly discovered that their military service, while earning them temporary acclaim, had not fundamentally changed American attitudes toward race. Many veterans found that the jobs they had left behind were no longer available to them. Some employers were reluctant to hire men who had been trained in the use of weapons and who might be less willing to accept discriminatory treatment. Others simply preferred to hire white workers who had not been away at war. Henry Johnson's experience was particularly tragic. Despite his fame as a war hero, he struggled to find steady employment after his return. his disabilities from his war wounds made it difficult for him to perform physical labor, and his celebrity status may have made some employers reluctant to hire him. Johnson turned to alcohol to cope with his physical pain and psychological trauma, beginning a downward spiral that would eventually lead to his death in poverty and obscurity in 1929. The contrast between Johnson's treatment by the French and American militaries was stark. France had immediately recognized his heroism with the Croix de Guerre and had celebrated him as a hero. The United States, despite extensive newspaper coverage of his exploits, was far slower to provide official recognition. Johnson was not awarded the Purple Heart until 1996, more than 60 years after his death. The Distinguished Service Cross came in 2002, and it was not until 2015 that he finally received the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration. Johnson's story reflected the broader experience of African American veterans returning from World War I. Despite their service and sacrifice, they found that American society was not ready to grant them the equality they had earned. The optimism and hope that had characterized the immediate post-war period gradually gave way to disillusionment as racial discrimination reasserted itself. The post-war period saw a resurgence of racial violence that was particularly disturbing, given the recent military service of many African American men. The summer of 1919 became known as Red Summer due to the numerous race riots that occurred across the country. In Washington, D.C., Chicago, and dozens of other cities, white mobs attacked African American communities, often targeting veterans who were seen as particularly threatening to the racial status quo. The violence was not one-sided. African American veterans trained in combat and confident from their military service were more willing to fight back than previous generations had been. The sight of uniformed black veterans defending their communities with military precision was deeply unsettling to white supremacists who had grown accustomed to unchallenged dominance. This new assertiveness among African American veterans represented a fundamental shift in black attitudes towards civil rights and equality. The men who had fought in France had seen a different world, one where they were treated with respect and dignity. They had proven their courage and competence on the battlefield, and they were no longer willing to accept second-class treatment without resistance. The experience of James Reese Europe exemplified both the promise and the tragedy of the post-war period. Europe returned from France as one of the most celebrated African-American figures in the country. His band had not only introduced jazz to Europe, but had also demonstrated the sophistication and artistry of African-American musicians. Europe was in high demand for performances and recordings, and he seemed poised to capitalize on his wartime fame. In February 1919, Europe and his band made new recordings for Pathé Records, capturing some of the music that had made them famous in France. These recordings, which included both instrumentals and vocals with Noble Sissle, showed the evolution of Europe's musical style. They incorporated blues influences and early jazz elements that were more advanced than his pre-war recordings. Europe embarked on a national tour with his band, filling venues across the country with audiences eager to hear the new phenomenon of jazz music. The tour was a tremendous success, demonstrating the growing appetite for this uniquely American art form. For a brief moment, it seemed that Europe and his musicians might be able to transcend racial barriers through the universal language of music. Tragically, Europe's promising post-war career was cut short on May 9, 1919, when he was murdered by one of his own band members following a dispute about the musician's performance. Herbert Wright, the drummer who killed Europe, stabbed him in the neck with a knife during an argument in Boston. Europe died at a local hospital that night, becoming one of the most prominent casualties of the post-war period. Europe's death was mourned throughout the African American community and beyond. He was given the first public funeral ever held for an African American in New York City, and he was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. U.B. Blake, the famous composer and pianist, eulogized Europe as the Martin Luther King of music, recognizing his role in breaking down barriers and advancing the cause of African American artists. The loss of Europe was symbolic of the broader challenges facing African American veterans in the post-war period. Despite their service and achievements, they continued to face violence, discrimination, and premature death. Europe's murder robbed the world of one of jazz music's founding fathers and demonstrated that even the most accomplished African Americans were not safe from racial violence. Meanwhile, other members of the 369th Infantry struggled with their own post-war adjustments. Many veterans suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though the condition was poorly understood at the time. The combination of combat trauma, racial discrimination, and economic hardship proved overwhelming for some former soldiers. Needham Roberts, Johnson's companion in the famous May 1918 battle, faced his own challenges upon returning home. His wounds from the German attack had left him partially disabled, making it difficult to find steady employment. Like Johnson, Roberts supplemented his income by giving lectures about his wartime experiences. But these speaking engagements provided neither financial security nor long-term career prospects. Roberts did receive some recognition for his service. He was awarded the Croix de Guerre by the French government and was celebrated as a hero upon his return to Trenton, New Jersey. The city organized a massive celebration in his honor, recognizing him as a favorite son who had distinguished himself in war. However, this local recognition did not translate into meaningful opportunities for advancement. Despite these individual hardships, the collective legacy of the 369th Infantry Regiment remained powerful. The regiment had shattered stereotypes about African American soldiers and had proven that black men could fight as effectively as any troops in the world. Their example inspired future generations of African American servicemen and helped lay the groundwork for the eventual integration of the US military. The French recognition of the 369th Infantry service stood in stark contrast to their treatment by the American military establishment. While France had awarded the Croix de Guerre to the entire regiment and had decorated 171 individual soldiers for valor, the US military was far more reluctant to acknowledge their achievements. This disparity reflected the deep-seated racial prejudices that continued to influence American military policy. The regiment's combat record was undeniable. They had served 191 consecutive days on the front lines, longer than any other American unit. They had participated in major battles including the Second Battle of the Marne, the Champagne-Marne Offensive, and the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. They had never lost ground to the enemy, and no member of the regiment had ever been captured alive, though some had been taken prisoner and later rescued. Arthur W. Little, who had served as a battalion commander in the 369th, documented their achievements in his post-war book, From Harlem to the Rhine. According to Little's official account, the regiment's combat record was exceptional by any standard. They had advanced when ordered, held their positions under the most difficult circumstances, and had consistently achieved their objectives, even when facing overwhelming odds. The casualty statistics told the story of their sacrifice. With approximately 1,500 killed and wounded out of a total strength of around 2,000 men, the 369th Infantry had suffered a casualty rate of roughly 75%. This was the highest loss rate of any American regiment in the war, reflecting both their extended time in combat and their aggressive fighting tactics. Yet despite this remarkable record of service and sacrifice, the 369th Infantry found themselves largely forgotten by official military histories. White units with far less distinguished records received more recognition and commemoration. The systematic exclusion of African American contributions from military histories would persist for decades, contributing to a national amnesia about the role of black soldiers in World War I. The individual stories of the men who served in the 369th Infantry reflected the broader African American experience in early 20th century America. These were men who had overcome poverty, discrimination, and limited opportunities to serve their country with distinction. They came from varied backgrounds but shared a common determination to prove their worth as Americans and as soldiers. take the story of Ed Williams, known to his comrades as Eagle Eye. Williams had been born in Charlotte, North Carolina in 1898 and had moved to New York as a young man seeking better opportunities. He enlisted in Company C of the 369th Infantry and distinguished himself in combat, earning the nickname Eagle Eye for his marksmanship skills. Williams was severely wounded on September 30th, 1918, during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, but survived to return home. After the war, Williams moved to South Carolina, where he married and started a family. Despite his military service and decorations, he found limited opportunities in the Jim Crow South. By 1940, he had moved his family back to New York City, where economic opportunities were somewhat better. Williams lived to the age of 95, dying in Brooklyn in 1993, one of the last survivors of the regiment. Ralph Hawkins, known as Kid Hawk, had a similar trajectory. Born in Elizabeth, New Jersey in 1898, Hawkins enlisted in the 369th at the age of 19. He served for 2 years in France, receiving both the French Croix de Guerre and the Bronze Star for his service. After the war, Hawkins re-enlisted in the New York National Guard, maintaining his connection to military service. During the Great Depression, Hawkins found work with the Works Progress Administration, one of the New Deal programs that provided employment for struggling Americans. He died in 1951 in Philadelphia and was buried in Pennsylvania, far from the battlefields where he had earned his fame. Herbert Taylor represented another common pattern among 369th veterans. Born in Newark, New Jersey in 1899, Taylor was just 19 when he enlisted in the regiment. He served with distinction in France and returned home to face the same challenges as his comrades: limited economic opportunities and persistent discrimination. Like many veterans, Taylor struggled to translate his military experience into civilian success. Alfred Manley, nicknamed Kid Buck, was born in Virginia in 1895, but had moved to New Jersey with his family by 1910. He enlisted in Company B of the 369th Infantry in July 1917, at the age of 19. Manley was awarded the Croix de Guerre for his service in France, and returned home to work as a chauffeur for a laundry company in Newark. While this was steady employment, it represented the kind of limited opportunity available to most African American veterans. These individual stories illustrate the broader pattern of the 369th Infantry's post-war experience. These were men who had served their country with honor and distinction, earning recognition from foreign governments and the respect of their comrades. Yet they returned to a society that offered them limited opportunities for advancement and continued to treat them as second-class citizens. The disconnect between their military achievements and their civilian treatment was particularly stark given the nature of their service. These men had faced some of the most dangerous combat of World War I. They had endured artillery bombardments, poison gas attacks, and brutal hand-to-hand fighting. They had proven their courage under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Yet when they returned home, they found that their military service counted for little in a society still dominated by racial prejudice. Jobs that should have been available to veterans were denied to them because of their race. Educational opportunities that might have helped them advance were limited or non-existent. The GI Bill benefits that would help World War II veterans were still decades away. The irony was not lost on these men or their families. They had fought to make the world safe for democracy, as President Wilson had phrased it, yet they found precious little democracy in their own country. They had helped defend French freedom while being denied basic freedoms at home. They had earned respect on foreign battlefields while being disrespected on American streets. This contradiction would fuel the growing civil rights movement in the decades that followed World War I. African American veterans, having seen what equality looked like in France, were no longer willing to accept inequality in America. Their military service gave them confidence and legitimacy in demanding better treatment. Their combat experience gave them skills and discipline that would prove valuable in the struggle for civil rights. The legacy of the 369th Infantry Regiment extended far beyond their World War I service. The unit was reconstituted after the war and continued to serve in the New York National Guard. During World War II, the 369th was reorganized as an anti-aircraft artillery regiment and again served with distinction, though they faced the same segregation and discrimination that had characterized their earlier service. The World War II iteration of the 369th included a young soldier named Jackie Robinson, who would later break the color barrier in professional baseball. Robinson's service with the regiment was brief, but it connected him to the proud tradition of African-American military service that the 369th represented. The regiment's World War II service was less celebrated than their World War I exploits, partly because anti-aircraft duty was less glamorous than infantry combat, and partly because the unit was overshadowed by other African-American military achievements, such as the Tuskegee Airmen. Nevertheless, the men of the 369th continued to serve their country with the same dedication that had characterized their predecessors. After World War II, the integration of the American military began in earnest. President Harry Truman's 1948 executive order desegregating the armed forces marked the beginning of the end for all black units like the 369th Infantry. The Korean War saw the first fully integrated American military operations, finally fulfilling the promise of equality that African American soldiers had been seeking for decades. The 369th Infantry was eventually reorganized as the 369th Sustainment Brigade, reflecting the modern military's emphasis on logistics and support operations. While the unit no longer serves as an infantry regiment, it continues to maintain the proud traditions and heritage of the original Harlem Hellfighters. The cultural impact of the 369th Infantry Regiment, particularly through James Reese Europe's band, cannot be overstated. The introduction of jazz music to European audiences during World War I helped launch a cultural revolution that continues to influence music around the world. Jazz became America's most distinctive cultural export, and its roots can be traced directly back to the performances of Europe's band in French hospitals, camps, and concert halls. The influence of jazz extended far beyond music. The syncopated rhythms and improvisational style of jazz reflected broader changes in American society, particularly the increasing assertiveness of African Americans in claiming their rightful place in the national culture. Jazz represented a uniquely American art form that could not be ignored or marginalized, much like the military service of the 369th Infantry Regiment. European audiences were particularly receptive to jazz, perhaps because they were less burdened by American racial prejudices. In Paris, jazz musicians found an acceptance and appreciation that was often denied to them in their home country. This European embrace of African American culture would later attract many black artists, writers, and musicians to live and work in Paris during the 1920s and beyond. The connection between military service and cultural achievement was particularly important for African Americans in the early 20th century. The success of the 369th Infantry Regiment on the battlefield and James Reese Europe's band in concert halls demonstrated that African Americans could excel in any field when given the opportunity. These achievements challenged racist stereotypes and provided inspiration for future generations. The story of the 369th Infantry Regiment also highlighted the complex relationships between African Americans and their white officers. Colonel William Haywood's leadership was crucial to the regiment's success, and his genuine respect for his men was evident throughout their service. Haywood fought for his soldiers' rights, lobbied for their recognition, and refused to accept discriminatory treatment even when it put him at odds with his superiors. Other white officers in the regiment also developed deep respect and affection for their men. Arthur Little's post-war writings reflected his admiration for the soldiers he had commanded and his recognition of the injustices they faced. These relationships demonstrated that racial prejudice was not inevitable, and that cooperation across racial lines was possible when based on mutual respect and shared goals. However, the presence of white officers in the 369th Infantry also reflected the limitations of the era's approach to racial equality. While these officers were generally supportive of their men, the assumption that black soldiers required white leadership reinforced racial hierarchies. The few African American officers in the regiment, such as Captain Charles Fillmore, proved that black men were equally capable of military leadership, but they remained exceptions rather than the rule. The international recognition received by the 369th Infantry Regiment was particularly significant given the global context of World War I. The war was fought at a time when European colonial empires were beginning to face challenges from independence movements in Africa, Asia, and other colonized regions. The performance of African American soldiers in France provided evidence that non-white peoples were capable of military excellence, potentially inspiring independence movements around the world. The French military's acceptance of African American soldiers contrasted sharply with the policies of the American military and reflected France's different approach to colonial troops. While France was certainly not free from racial prejudice, French military commanders had extensive experience working with African soldiers from their colonial empire. This experience made them more willing to accept African American troops and to judge them based on their performance rather than their race. The German response to the 369th Infantry Regiment was also revealing. The nickname Hellfighters reflected genuine respect for their fighting abilities, even from their enemies. German military reports acknowledged the effectiveness of African American troops and warned their soldiers to expect fierce resistance when facing them. This enemy recognition validated the regiment's combat effectiveness in a way that American praise might not have, since it came from adversaries who had no reason to exaggerate their opponent's abilities. The psychological impact of the 369th Infantry Regiment's service extended beyond their immediate military achievements. For African Americans who had been told repeatedly that they were inferior and incapable of military service, the regiment's success provided powerful evidence to the contrary. Young black men across the country could point to the Harlem Hellfighters as proof that they too could serve their country with honor and distinction. This inspiration was particularly important for future military leaders. Benjamin O. Davis Sr., who would become the first African American general in the U.S. Army, served as commander of the 369th Infantry Regiment during the 1930s. Davis undoubtedly drew inspiration from the regiment's World War I legacy as he worked to advance African American opportunities in the military. The legacy of the 369th Infantry Regiment also influenced the development of the civil rights movement. The regiment's service provided a powerful argument for racial equality. If African Americans could fight and die for their country, how could they be denied basic civil rights? This argument would be used repeatedly by civil rights activists in the decades following World War I. Organizations like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People used the military service of the 369th Infantry and other African American units to challenge segregation and discrimination. The contrast between the equality African American soldiers had experienced in France and the inequality they faced at home became a rallying cry for civil rights activists. The regiment's story also demonstrated the importance of documentation and historical preservation. Arthur Little's book, From Harlem to the Rhine, provided a contemporary account of the regiment's service that helped preserve their story for future generations. Without such documentation, the achievements of the 369th Infantry might have been lost to history, as happened with many other African American military units. The photographs taken by James Van der Zee, the famous Harlem photographer, captured the dignity and pride of the returning veterans. These images provided visual evidence of African American military service and helped counter negative stereotypes. Van der Zee's portraits of soldiers like Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts in their uniforms and medals became iconic representations of African American heroism. The treatment of the 369th Infantry Regiment's legacy in American popular culture reflected broader patterns of racial exclusion and inclusion. For decades after World War I, their story was largely absent from mainstream military histories and popular accounts of the war. When African American military service was mentioned at all, it was often marginalized or minimized. This began to change during the civil rights era of the 1950s and 1960s, when historians and activists began to recover and publicize the forgotten stories of African American military service. Books, documentaries, and museum exhibits began to give the 369th Infantry Regiment the recognition they deserved. The creation of Black History Month provided an annual opportunity to highlight their achievements. The internet age has brought renewed attention to the regiment's story. Online resources, digital archives, and social media have made it easier for people to learn about the Harlem Hellfighters and to share their story with others. Military history enthusiasts, educators, and civil rights advocates have all contributed to keeping their memory alive. Recent years have seen a surge of interest in the 369th Infantry Regiment's story. In 2021, Congress awarded the Harlem Hellfighters the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor that Congress can bestow. This recognition, coming more than a century after their service, represented a long overdue acknowledgement of their contributions to American military history. The Congressional Gold Medal ceremony was attended by surviving family members of regiment veterans and representatives of the modern 369th Sustainment Brigade. The event provided an opportunity to reflect on both the achievements of the original Harlem Hellfighters and the progress that had been made in addressing racial inequality in the military and society. Educational institutions have also played a role in preserving and promoting the regiment's legacy. Schools across the country now include the story of the 369th Infantry Regiment in their curricula, ensuring that future generations will learn about their service and sacrifice. Military academies and war colleges use their example to teach lessons about leadership, courage, and overcoming adversity. Museums and historical sites have created exhibits dedicated to the regiment's service. The National World War I Museum and Memorial in Kansas City, the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., and numerous local history museums have displays that tell their story. These exhibits help visitors understand both the military history and the broader social context of their service. The story of the 369th Infantry Regiment has also inspired works of fiction, including graphic novels, historical novels, and even video games. These creative works help introduce their story to new audiences and demonstrate the continuing relevance of their legacy. While fictional treatments sometimes take liberties with historical facts, they generally serve to increase public awareness of the regiment's achievements. Documentary films have been particularly effective in telling the regiment's story. The combination of historical footage, expert interviews, and dramatic recreations helps bring their experiences to life for modern audiences. These documentaries have been broadcast on television networks and shown in schools, reaching millions of viewers who might not otherwise learn about the Harlem Hellfighters. The musical legacy of James Reese Europe has also been preserved and celebrated. Jazz historians and musicians have recorded new performances of Europe's compositions, ensuring that his musical innovations continue to be heard. The connection between the 369th Infantry Regiment and the development of jazz music has become an important part of both military and musical history. Modern military units continue to draw inspiration from the 369th Infantry Regiment's example. The values they demonstrated, courage, determination, unit cohesion, and professional excellence, remain relevant for today's soldiers. Military leaders often cite their example when discussing the importance of diversity and inclusion in the armed forces. The integration of the American military, which began in earnest after World War II, can be traced directly back to the service of units like the 369th Infantry Regiment. Their combat effectiveness helped disprove racist theories about African American military capabilities and provided a foundation for later integration efforts. Today's integrated military owes a debt to the pioneers who served in segregated units with distinction. The story of the 369th Infantry Regiment also provides important lessons about the costs of discrimination and segregation. The talent and dedication of these soldiers was nearly wasted due to racist policies that sought to exclude them from combat service. How many other contributions were lost because qualified individuals were denied opportunities based on their race? The regiment's story serves as a reminder of the importance of judging people based on their abilities rather than their background. At the same time, their story demonstrates the resilience and determination of people facing systemic discrimination. Despite being treated as second-class citizens, the men of the 369th Infantry Regiment maintained their dignity and performed their duties with excellence. They refused to let prejudice define them or limit their contributions. Their example continues to inspire people facing various forms of discrimination today. The international dimensions of their story remain relevant in our globalized world. The respect they earned from French military commanders and civilians demonstrated that American racial prejudices were not universal. Their positive reception in France provided them with a different perspective on their own worth and capabilities. In today's interconnected world, international perspectives continue to influence domestic social and political developments. The technological and tactical innovations that emerged from World War I, many of which the 369th Infantry Regiment helped to develop and implement, also have continuing relevance. Their adaptation to trench warfare, use of new weapons systems, and integration with Allied forces provided lessons that influenced military doctrine for decades. Modern military professionals continue to study World War I combat experiences for insights that remain applicable today. The leadership lessons from the 369th Infantry Regiment's service are particularly valuable. Colonel Hayward's advocacy for his soldiers, Lieutenant Europe's innovation in military music, and the courage of enlisted men like Henry Johnson all provide examples of leadership at different levels. These examples are studied in military leadership courses and continue to influence how leaders approach challenging situations. The medical and psychological aspects of their service also provide important historical insights. The treatment of combat wounds, the understanding of what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder, and the long-term health consequences of military service were all issues that affected regiment members. Their experiences contributed to the development of military medicine and veterans care programs. The economic dimensions of their service and post-war experiences highlight important issues about veterans' benefits and opportunities. The limited economic prospects faced by many regiment veterans reflected broader patterns of discrimination that affected African American communities for decades. Their struggles helped inform later efforts to ensure that veterans receive appropriate support and benefits. The family and community impacts of their service extended far beyond the individual soldiers. Wives, children, parents, and siblings all felt the effects of their military service, both during the war and in the years that followed. The stories of military families, including the hardships they endured and the pride they felt, are an important part of the regiment's overall legacy. As we reflect on the story of the 369th Infantry Regiment, we must remember that their achievements came at enormous personal cost. The Pantheon 500 casualties they suffered represented not just numbers in a military report, but individual lives cut short or forever changed. Each of those casualties was someone's son, husband, father, or brother. Each death was mourned by family and friends who would never see their loved one return home. The psychological wounds carried by survivors were often invisible, but no less real. Many veterans struggled with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though effective treatment was not available at the time. The combination of combat trauma and racial discrimination created burdens that some veterans carried for the rest of their lives. Yet despite these costs, the men of the 369th Infantry Regiment never wavered in their commitment to their country and their fellow soldiers. They understood that they were fighting for something larger than themselves. They were fighting to prove that African Americans deserved respect and equality. They were fighting to open doors for future generations. They were fighting to make America live up to its founding ideals of liberty and justice for all. Their sacrifice was not in vain. While progress toward racial equality was slower than they might have hoped, their service helped lay the foundation for the civil rights advances that would follow. Every African American who has served in the military since World War I has benefited from the precedent they established. Every advancement in civil rights can be traced in part back to the courage they displayed on foreign battlefields. Today, more than a century after their service, the story of the 369th Infantry Regiment continues to resonate. In a time when America continues to grapple with issues of race and equality, their example provides both inspiration and instruction. They showed that courage and patriotism transcend racial boundaries. They demonstrated that America is strongest when all citizens are able to contribute their talents and abilities. Their story also reminds us that progress is often slow and incomplete. Despite their heroic service, the men of the 369th Infantry Regiment returned to a society that continued to deny them basic rights and opportunities. It would take decades more struggle and sacrifice before the promise of equality began to be fulfilled. Even today, that promise remains incomplete. But the legacy of the Harlem Hellfighters endures. Their courage in the face of enemy fire, their dignity in the face of discrimination, and their unwavering patriotism in the face of injustice continue to inspire new generations of Americans. They remind us that true heroism is not just about what we do in moments of crisis, but how we conduct ourselves every day in the face of adversity. The men of the 369th Infantry Regiment were more than just soldiers. They were pioneers who broke down barriers and opened doors. They were artists who introduced the world to new forms of music and expression. They were citizens who demanded that America live up to its highest ideals. They were human beings who refused to let others define their worth or limit their potential. Their story is ultimately an American story. It reflects both the best and worst of American society. It shows how prejudice and discrimination can waste human potential and deny basic justice. But it also shows how courage and determination can overcome even the most entrenched barriers. It demonstrates that America's strength comes not from uniformity, but from the diverse contributions of all its citizens. As we remember the Harlem Hellfighters, we honor not just their military service, but their broader contributions to American society. We remember their sacrifice and celebrate their achievements. We acknowledge the injustices they faced and commit ourselves to ensuring that such injustices are not repeated. We draw inspiration from their example and rededicate ourselves to the ongoing work of building a more perfect union. The story of the 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters, stands as a testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome adversity and achieve greatness. In the trenches of France, they proved that heroism has no color. In the concert halls of Paris, they proved that artistic genius transcends racial boundaries. In the streets of Harlem, they proved that American citizens deserve respect and equality regardless of their background. Their legacy lives on in every African American who serves in today's integrated military. It lives on in every jazz musician who builds upon the foundations they helped establish. It lives on in every citizen who refuses to accept discrimination and fights for justice and equality. It lives on in the continuing struggle to make America a country where all people can achieve their full potential. The Harlem Hellfighters earned their place in history through their courage, their sacrifice, and their unwavering commitment to the ideals of freedom and democracy. They faced down German machine guns and American prejudice with equal bravery. They fought for a country that did not always appreciate their service, but they never stopped believing in what that country could become. In remembering their story, we honor not just their individual achievements, but the broader struggle for human dignity and equality that they represented. Their example reminds us that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they have the courage to stand up for what is right. Their legacy challenges us to continue that struggle in our own time and in our own way. The Harlem Hellfighters, America's most decorated World War I regiment, proved that heroism knows no boundaries of race or background. Their story continues to inspire us more than a century later, reminding us of both how far we have come and how far we still have to go in building a truly just and equal society. If you enjoyed learning about these incredible soldiers and their lasting impact on American military history and culture, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, sacrifice, and determination from history's most compelling conflicts. The legacy of the Harlem Hellfighters deserves to be remembered and shared with each new generation of Americans who inherit the freedoms they helped defend.